For this final session of the first day of the Covering Rare Diseases program, we're joined by Dr. Emil Kakkis. He is the founder and president and CEO of Ultragenyx, a company founded to create a steady pipeline of effective therapies for patients with rare and ultra-rare diseases. One of the very first conversations I had when planning this fellowship was with Dr. Kakkis, because I had seen him make a presentation at a webinar with UCSF earlier this year. And his frank, contextualized, provocative comments about the barriers to rare disease research made me realize he was exactly the kind of researcher and thought leader that the journalists in this program would need to hear from. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Kakkis.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for those comments, Rachel.
So I'd like to start simply because you are also the author of Saving Ryan, a 30-year journey into saving the life of a child. Could you please start by telling us a little bit about that book and why you wrote it?
Well, Saving Ryan is the work I did originally as an academic professional, developing a treatment for a rare disease called MPS1, or mucopolysaccharidosis. And one of the things, if you're interested in rare disease and covering them, you have to spell a lot of really complicated names. But MPS is a horrible lysosomal disease, which diagnosed a few years of age will lead to death by kids by the time they're 10 or 20 years old. Ryan was a little kid affected by this, and his family in Texas was looking for someone to save their kid. Before I met them, I was working on a project, but it was an abstract project, a science project on how to treat MPS1 in the dog model of that disease. And the two of us connected finally when his father found my mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Neufeld, and she connected us, and they saved the program by raising money to keep it going. Because at that time, which is in the 1990s, there was really no interest in these kind of rare disease treatments, even ones where there was great promise. The book basically chronicles the story of trying to develop a treatment for this rare disease in the environment that existed, the lack of support, and a family struggling to overcome impossible odds. Together, we worked on getting the program moving forward, eventually developed a treatment, and worked through then the regulatory process. That process was also challenging because the government, the FDA, had not had that much experience in this area. But eventually, we did get it through. We got it approved after a dramatic, almost courtroom scene like in the advisory committee meeting. And they voted 12-0 for the product, and we got approved. So Saving Ryan is that shred of story, taking a disease that no one cared about except those affected, and developing the first ever treatment and getting it done. Just for because I didn't give you the follow-up, this was, the product was approved in 2003. It's called Aldurazyme, but Ryan now has been on treatment for 24 years, grew up, graduated high school, graduated college, got engaged, and last summer I went to his wedding. So he's now married 34-year-old. Grew up where it seemed impossible when he first got diagnosed.
And that must be an incredible experience for you to have had.
Oh, yes.
Again, from our first conversation, the one thing that resonated the most with me was your statement that essentially most of the gatekeepers and the people making decisions about policies, about treatments, about who to fund and who not to fund, have absolutely no experience of rare disease. They're not doctors, they're not researchers. Explain to the journalists what you meant by saying that and what the implications of that are.
Well, there are a lot of people that affect the ability to develop rare disease treatments, but the challenge, of course, is that there's not a lot of research dollars initially to support it. And so that's one part of the process that they're not getting the attention they deserve. But in the drug development process that was described in Saving Ryan, we ended up working with the regulators where there were individuals who, they may have been doctors, but they were not trained in the medicine at all, in the field of medicine. They never seen a patient, didn't know anything about it. Now, if you and I went to a doctor at a hospital, right, they would require them to get credentialed, and therefore they'd have to be boarded in the medicine area you were in. But if you're at FDA, you don't have to be boarded in anything. You can be any doctor, not even board certified, and actually regulate the drugs. And the challenge for us in the rare disease space then is that we've had people who were family practice doctors or people that were actually, surgeon we had once, that have no idea about these inborn errors, these complex metabolic disorders. And that's just the FDA's trouble hiring people. But I think that they need to set standards on who's truly qualified, and we need to help them be able to recruit the talent. But those are some of the key gatekeepers. And this is not just FDA, really, it's EMA, it's globally. And so you have those people involved. You then have the challenge of people in talking about reimbursement, of deciding whether this is worthwhile or not. A first ever treatment. For example, with our MPS 7 program, we got it approved. And in France, they said, well, the trial was too small. Well, of course it was small. There's only 200 people in the world with this disease. So Rachel, what could they expect? It was a small trial, got approved in Europe and the US, but reimbursers then use the limited size of the data set to say, hey, we don't think this is worth treating, even though it affects a handful of patients. So both at the regulatory step and the reimbursement step, we're dealing with really complicated diseases for which there's very few people that know what's going on. And it creates a real challenge when you're trying to develop a first ever treatment.
Are you having to counterbalance that with the fact that this is, could literally be a matter of life and death? And if a mistake is made, even though it may be one patient with a 1 in a million disease, but there are repercussions to having that happen.
There are. I think the challenge is their feeling of how imminent or how much their decisions will be blamed with the death of the person. Some of these diseases take some years to die. They're very sick and they take time, and so they maybe feel less connected to that. On occasion, many reimbursers will say, for this rare disease, I'd rather not take the risk of that, and therefore we'll cover it. But if you imagine how many different insurers there are and how many different opinions and positions take, it does become a bit of a battle trying to figure out and help people get covered. Now, in the US at Ultragenyx, we know about this battle, and we also are concerned about the ability to treat and provide access to all patients. So we set our own policy that we'll make sure everyone gets treated one way or another, whether we help them through a nonprofit buy other insurance if their insurance won't cover it, or we provide free drug. And our goal here is to work with the insurance system to get as good a reimbursement we can, but at the same time, we don't want to let patients go untreated because of the holes in the system in terms of recognizing the importance of these treatments.
Can you explain the difference to the journalists between a rare and ultra rare disease?
Right now, those terms are relatively subjective, but in the US, when people say rare, they're generally referring to the Orphan Drug Act definition of 200,000 patients or less in the United States. That was the original size of what was considered rare in 1982. When we talk about ultra rare, we normally think of it as something less than, let's say, 5,000 or 6,000 patients in the US. Most of these we work on, the majority of them are less than 5,000 patients in the US. I think that would be considered more ultra rare. It turns out when we did the math, and I did this at the Every Life Foundation, which I founded and on the board of, but in early days, we did an analysis based on known prevalence, and about 85% of the rare diseases that are being currently described and listed in Orphanet are less than 5,000 in the US. So 85% of the rares are actually ultra rare. And I think it's important to recognize that we have a whole bunch of very small diseases. And with the advent of precision medicine and even more finely dividing disease states into particular genetic types, we very well could have a lot of more common diseases ultimately be considered rare.
I think when we first talked, I told you about the fact that we have a truly international cohort. So we have journalists from many of the regions of the world here. And so one of the themes of conversation that we've touched on is the fact that so much of what we know about genomics is based on data derived from Europe, US, et cetera. So where does this leave us in terms of the value of the whole genomic field when it comes to whole swaths of the earth that haven't been able to catch up yet?
Well, there's two levels of this. One is getting the correct diagnosis for patients, and the other is actually getting access to treatments too. The sequencing is certainly getting more accessible than it was, and many are trying to push for sequencing of everyone or every birth. Between that and where we are today, there's certainly levels of sequencing that should become more universally done. And I think in the UK, there's a project, for example, to sequence all newborns who enter a neonatal ICU. Now, not everyone will have NICUs, but let's think of it conceptually. What they're really saying is, let's sequence all the kids that are sick, are having a serious problem. I think that's a good place to go. And I do think that if we sequence all sick patients, we should try to make that accessible, Rachel, everywhere. That would help us maybe identify the causes of disease when they are genetic. And they're not always genetic, Rachel. Like many times there are other causes that are non-genetic, but it would help us understand the frequency and breadth of genetic causes. And it also would help us understand, Rachel, the contribution of genetic predisposition. In other words, the disease might not be a genetic disease, but you get into this problem because you have this type genotype. Does that make sense? It's a risk factor, in other words, not the actual cause. That is something else that could be figured out. That is, we might discover that people with this particular problem, and if is predisposed by having a particular genetic background, our ability to understand that data would be important across all types in all areas of the world. I think it would also be a lot more tractable to sequence sick kids as opposed to every birth at this point. So that's one area to think about internationally. The access to drugs issue, because once you find diagnoses, Rachel, there's a natural feeling we should be treating people, right? It's to diagnose them and treat them doesn't make sense. And I think in the rare disease space, there is unfortunately substantial inequality in how rare disease drugs are becoming accessible or not. In the major developed areas, these drugs are very expensive because they involve the development costs being spread out over a relatively small number of patients, and it ends up making it impossible for some areas. And this is a great concern to us as a rare disease company because we think it's not fulfilling our mission if we have only major countries, developed countries, get access, and we don't have other people getting access. But some treatments may be very difficult to get access. But you
actually gave a very powerful example of a drug. Could you restate that for the journalist? One particular dose was 1 point something million. I can't recall it right offhand.
Yeah. Well, the drug of interest was Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy for SMA or spinal muscular atrophy. And that's about 1.8 million. Now, Novartis, who bought Avexis, the company that was making that drug, was providing some compassionate access, but they got highly criticized because that access program was based on a lottery because there was limited supply. However, at the same time, somewhere near the same time, they closed an extra plant in Colorado that could have been making more drug, which to me is truly unfortunate. To take on a disease like that that whatever benefits they would have in terms of treating these really sick kids in many places comes with the responsibility to provide access to more countries. And while it may be hard to provide access to everyone in the world, they should be doing more, right, than just supporting developing countries and allowing a lottery as a way to treat really sick babies. So that was one example. And how do you imagine $1.8 million treatments? I mean, that is probably the entire budget for some small cities for healthcare, right? In that amount, it doesn't make sense. But I think if you think of the company's revenue across the whole world, that some areas they couldn't provide the drug at that kind of price. Can we find a way to provide greater access to the drugs while maintaining the revenue required in order to make the investment in all these difficult things? I think we have to find a way, Rachel, because it's not okay, I think, to develop a gene therapy and then end up with a small fraction of the world's population actually getting access to it.
And you told me about the fact that I think Ultragenyx, or is it the Every Life Foundation, that has a program that addresses just that. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Well, we operate, we do support compassionate use for our products, Rachel, and it's part of our philosophy as a company to provide access. Now, for MEPSEVI, which is our enzyme therapy for MPS 7, we've gotten requests from around the world. And while I don't think we could afford to treat every kid from around the world, every kid that has asked us, we have supplied treatment. And that is the biggest barrier often is the local government, frankly. We have a kid from Malaysia, for example, with a kid with MPS 7 who contacted us, and we figured out a way to get treatment of that kid in Malaysia. We've had a request from Algeria, and we've been working. We're ready to give them the treatment, but the government has been more challenging in Algeria. But for MPS 7, we take the standard that we should be providing compassionate access as part of our responsibility that we take on for the privilege of developing a treatment for a rare disease.
In one of our earlier conversations as well, we talked about this sort of colonialism in global health writ large, but certainly when it comes to research and science, one of the speakers used the term there's sort of an extractive attitude. In other words, sending in people to get the data and then leaving, and the local populations never get any benefit out of that. So do you agree that that is a challenge or part of the problem in genomic advancement in low and middle income countries?
Well, I think that reference might have been particularly to people looking for using biodiversity to discover compounds in the forest or something. The question I would say to you, Rachel, relates more to common biotech companies would be conductive clinical trials, like in a country, right? You conduct a trial, the people put their kids in the trial, what happens afterward, right? So most of the companies, and certainly our company, if we put people in a trial, we would not remove them from the drug. They would be on treatment. If there's a benefit to it being on treatment and no inappropriate risk. So that's our commitment to maintaining. With regard to Rachel gene therapy trials, since it's a one-time treatment, then there's a great benefit, because if they participate, they'll get treated. And the question is, will they get treated later? Will the country be able to pay for it, given how expensive it is? So I do think there is some risk of that, where people do trials in developing countries and then don't really provide access to the drug. I think companies have to behave in a responsible way, and our view would be that, for example, with MEPSEVI, wherever we did a trial, patients would stay on the drug. We wouldn't remove them from drug. We continue them with compassionate use. For Dojolvi, another drug for fatty acid oxidation, we do compassionate use, and we maintain anyone who's on the drug. we just acquired the product Evkeeza from Regeneron for ex-US, and that includes patients who are in South Africa in their trial, as well as Ukraine, which of course has been incredibly difficult. But we are maintaining then compassionate use for those patients, right? So that we're not going to cut them off after they contribute to a trial, right? And I think that's the policy probably is needed. I think we have to consider that part of the cost of developing treatments, but we also have to think about our mission as a company, which is develop treatments that treat kids that are affected by disease. And I tell people there's only one rare nation. We're not different countries. We are one rare nation, and we need to figure out how to make it all work and not differentiate which country you're from.
That's actually fascinating. That was one of the follow-up questions, and that is because the term rare or the word rare is part of the term, it continues in some sectors to be a barrier to attention or people investing in the research. But I love that term, rare nation. We are a rare nation. Is this a messaging or a language thing that we need to be working on?
Well, we talk about the fact that 10% of the population is rare. It's just that each disease is so individually rare that they don't add up. But if you add them all up, all the different rares, this 10% of the world population has a rare disease. That ends up being bigger than many other well-known diseases as a group. And so when I talk about rare nation, it's really about the power of combining the constituents across all diseases. They all have the same problem. The treatments either for 95% don't exist. The 5% do exist. Many of them are expensive, and the access may be more challenging. Therefore, they all are in the same boat. And when we hold at the Every Life Foundation, we hold our Capitol Hill Days in Washington, D.C., we get hundreds of people from across the country who've never met each other, Rachel, but they immediately feel they feel compassion, connection to each other, just meeting each other for the first time because they've all been in that same place. So that identity of being someone affected by something terrible that's unusual or rare is what is at the core of the rare nation identity and what bonds us together in terms of suffering with extreme and untreated disease usually.
One more question about global development, and particularly in research and science. And I wonder if the issue of capacity building is something that Western nations need to commit to more deeply in terms of providing the education, the study opportunities, the equipment, the facilities for low and medium income countries. Do you feel like that's something, or do you feel that these countries themselves need to step up their own internal commitments?
Well, I think you actually need a little bit of both, Rachel. All these problems are always going to require multifactorial solutions. I think companies making rare disease products as part of their plan have to, once they've gotten going, they've created enough revenue and business that they start now investing in solutions that deal with other parts of the world, which could include setting up manufacturing, local manufacturing as a way to supply locally. I think that's the direction it should go in. I also think governments should be looking at generic and follow-on biologic drugs as a place where they could start developing their own facilities and develop those processes and produce product as an investment in national health and in their economic development. But I do think that some companies will have to bring things forward. In the past with HIV, there were licenses given for people to make drug, but those drugs were being made in certain countries that already had drug making. And the question is, could that translate to other countries? And I think it has. I know there is, for example, in Africa, there's been some more work in this. I think in other countries, there has been a movement in that direction. And I think that rare disease companies should also think about the end game, which is what happens after these patents are gone, you've done your part. How do we leave this so that we have broader access of a more cost-efficient supply for this treatment that we've spent so much time figuring out? And for us, the Dojolvi product we have now is like, I think my first product I really want to think about, because the manufacturing of that is probably doable in a lot of places. It's not necessarily impossible. It would be an easier lift. It is a treatment that would keep kids functioning like normal kids, right? As long as they don't have these crises, they would do better with that disease. So it's the kind of treatment that I think would do great to keep kids from getting sick repeatedly with that fatty acid oxidation defect disease, and be something amenable, given that it's an oral treatment. So I think that companies should do more, governments should do their part, and we should be working on reducing the gap between who has access to rare disease treatments and who doesn't.
We have a question from fellow Hawken Miller. Hawken.
Hi, Emil. I'll just preface this by saying I met you recently through actually my parents' foundation, Cure Duchenne, and just really appreciate the work that you're doing for the rare disease community and with Every Life. And I also read your book and recommend all the fellows take a look at it. I think it's very elucidating to understand like the process of FDA approvals. But I am focusing my story on, you mentioned precision medicine, and how do you treat millions of people out there that have different genomes, different genetics, effectively and equitably. And I'm curious where data science fits in, and biorepositories, and just a greater amount of data on people from all over the world can help with that.
Well, one of my big pushes, Hawken, on, thank you for your comments. One of my big pushes on the whole precision medicine thing is that we talk about using precision medicine as tools that treat a particular individual, but we don't talk about how do we measure disease in individuals, which kind of has to go with it. And what we think of these as biomarkers, but I've recently wrote an editorial about the need to establish biomarkers that are at the core of disease, that allow us to capture the essence of disease, and that we need what I would call our precision medicine disease measurement that goes with our precision disease treatment. If we can have that measurement too, then it allows us, and I'm talking about as an inexpensive, quick way to measure the disease. It will allow you then to, on any individual case, figure out what are you doing. Because if you want to treat people, you got to know, are you helping them? But if you're helping them requires running a 500 patient trial and doing some kind of complex clinical test, then you won't be able to do that. You won't be able to have equity because you'll be unable to do all that work. But if you had a careful biomarker that would allow you to measure disease in an individual that you could do cost efficiently, then it opens the door to more individualized and more ready access without the burdens of large trials. So I do think it's one of the areas, Hawken, I think would be improved.
What was the editorial written?
It was written this year, earlier in the year, in Molecular Genetics and Metabolism. And it was basically about the use of accelerated biomarkers for accelerated approval. And my goal is, I say it's time for a change. Historically, we define diseases as being how a patient feels, functions, or survives, and that our treatment should improve how a patient feels, functions, survives, which all makes sense. But a lot of our diseases are, especially now that we're looking at them from a precision medicine standpoint, are hard to measure in that way, and they're highly variable. But if you had a really precise disease activity biomarker, that you would have a more potent and powerful way of monitoring an individual patient and their treatment, as well as conducting trials, and it would transform the development process, just like it transformed HIV drug development. So the argument is, whatever the transformational process that existed for HIV drug development that created multiple drugs and highly active retroviral therapy should be applied to are these rare diseases so that we can rapidly develop better combinations, better drugs, and improve the accessibility of these drugs as well.
Thanks, Emil.
I am going to ask a couple of questions that help me contextually to think about this issue. And the one is, we just heard from Dr. William Gall before you spoke, and he talked about the undiagnosed diseases, obviously, but I posed the question to him that because it's called undiagnosed diseases and it has its own separate sector, does this mean that we may be vastly undercounting the amount of rare disease that exists in the world?
Well, there's probably two things. Yes, we are undercounting the number of rare diseases, and the sequencing of the human genome and the advent of cost-effective genetic sequencing, Rachel, has opened the door to actually discovering more of these genes that affect diseases. So there are many more genetic diseases than we realize right now, and I think we're going to be discovering additional ones. A good example is a disease called NGLY1, which got discovered just a few years ago. Now there's maybe 30 in the world. That's an example of a new disease, which has a phenotype and is now being described. But when they're rare, it's hard to find those cases, but sequencing allows you to do that. So that's definitely one piece of the story. The other part of the story that Dr. Gall has been dealing with is that there are people that have a diagnosable disease, but it's complicated and the medical system's not as good at getting to the answer. And here, Rachel, there's a simpler solution, which is a little related to our earlier discussion, which is if a patient has a very difficult, complex disease of some kind that is causing them great harm, we should be supporting our insurance system, the healthcare system of the world should be supporting doing sequencing for that patient. Just as I said, for patients like babies in the hospital, we should be doing the sequencing because there's no reason in the world that it should take several years and multiple doctors and multiple tests to finally end up with a sequencing test would have given you the answer right out the gate. And the reason, Rachel, this is necessary is one thing that would be good for your journalists to understand is that your brain expresses 10-fold more genes than everywhere else in your body. That means that most of the random genetic disease out there will affect your brain more particularly than the rest of your body. The problem with that is that the phenotype of the brain disease will look very similar. There'll be developmental delay, there might be seizures, there'll be some other complex neurological problems. And so there's a whole lot of diseases that look like that, Rachel, which you won't be able to figure out off the bat. You won't be able to distinguish readily without sequencing. And so if we had routine sequencing allowed and supported by insurance or healthcare systems for anyone with a complex, difficult problem, I think that would help. At the same time, while we do more sequencing, even of normal people and others, we will discover new genes and new diseases, and we'll have to do the science to figure out how are they affecting us. Are they causing direct disease, or are they complicating common disease that we hadn't been thinking about?
I'm going to try to get Diana Chiangwa. She's from South Africa, one of our fellows. Can we try again, Diana? If not, I will ask it for her. She says, in South Africa, we had a case of one of two young girls who had progeria, and passed on at the age of 18 in 2017. In your opinion, do you think South Africa missed an opportunity to open more doors to research on rare disease because most of her clinical trials were done in Europe?
Well, progeria is so rare that reaching out and trying to get your patients in trials, I think is something countries should do. What's generally happening, Rachel, is the people who are doing the trials, and I know in progeria they were trying to repurpose drugs that were for other purposes to try to use in that disease. they're usually strapped. They don't have the financial wherewithal to go and search the world. And if countries out there who identify patients like this could more readily connect in and get registered and allow their patients to be known, then it might have been more possible to get their patients involved in trials. It is sometimes hard to conduct a trial distantly, but what I would say to you in the rare world is that we need to get better at these disseminated clinical trials, right? Where the trial is being done in a lot of different individual places, because expecting every progeria kid from South Africa and every other distant area to come to London or some other place is hard. It's hard to do. And we need to kind of develop better systems at doing these disseminated trials to capture treatment across the world. And I think countries should do more to get their kids connected. The challenge, I would say, for South Africa or many countries is they have a long list of health issues on their docket. And usually the rare ones are just far down the list. And it's not a mistake. They have a lot of really serious health issues to manage, but it's unfortunate.
Here's another context question from me. Dr. Green this morning said that 32 years ago, there were 61 rare diseases that we knew the genomic basis for, and today there are 6,000. So we've cut that window, or the growth has exploded past 32 years. On the other hand, it seems there are some intractable barriers to developing treatment. You've talked about some of them, obviously, but are we going to see that kind of again, exponential growth in the next decade, hopefully, or we're going to continue to fight the same battles?
Right. Well, Rachel, I used to do a graph for the EveryLife Foundation, which said at the current FDA approval rate of like 30 a year of orphan drugs, with 6,000 diseases, it will take about 250, 300 years before we have a treatment for all of them. If you assume that that's actually going to happen, the truth is the pace is way slow for what's required. Our ability to generate precision data knowledge about the treatment, about the disease, and now precision treatments is far exceed our ability to develop and regulate them. Part of my editorials on this very issue, Rachel, that we need to get better at measuring the course of disease so that we can run very efficient studies that look at looking what's wrong. And the way I describe it, Rachel, is a biomarker is like, if you look at a car as an equivalent, a biomarker would be like measuring the brakes on the car. Does the brake work or not? What we're doing now in clinical development is measuring crashes, car crashes, right? Car crashes take time. Your brakes may be broken. Whether you have a car crash or not depends on a lot of other factors, right? And you have to monitor a lot of cars with broken brakes to see the crashes. That's not a very efficient way to do it, Rachel. If we just measure the brakes, right? We don't wait for car crashes. We all know that broken brakes will lead to car crashes. We don't need that explanation every single time. If we can then fix the brakes, measure and fix the brakes, we can do this more efficiently, more rapidly. In HIV, you could run a 30, 40 patient trial and quickly know within 6, 12 weeks whether your drug was working. You would not have to run 7-year trials with hundreds of people. That's the transformation of the process. If we can get that process more routinely accepted, Rachel, then we can run really small trials, get data on what's happening, and drive forward a different model for drug development that would lower the cost of it. And I think potentially lower the cost of rare disease drugs too, because if the cost of development and the time is shortened, we could have a much better cost structure with a lower development cost, lower drug cost, and more patients getting treated. So there's a big win in there for society if we can figure that out.
Shiraz, has your microphone been fixed? Can we hear you? No. Okay. So Shiraz is from Pakistan, and he asks, when a new rare disease is being discovered, can we say that maybe some of the old ones are proceeding?
It's actually a mixture of things happening, Rachel. For example, in the case of MPS1, the disease I was talking about earlier, there were 3 different versions of it: Shea version, Hurler Shea version. Of course, in the end, it turned out they're all the same gene. They're just modification of the same gene. And that's been true in other situations. That is, there's common genetic diseases that have different severity. They look like different things, but they're actually the same genetic disease. It's just a spectrum. And so in some cases, the genetics have narrowed the spectrum. In other cases, it turns out that a disease looks very similar to each other, but actually there's 5 or 6 different genes involved. And so like Bardet-Biedl syndrome is a rare syndrome which has, I think, 5 or 6 different genes. These genes all record proteins that work together in a complex. If you mess up the complex, then you get the disease. That makes sense. But if there's 5 or 6 things put together, any one of them can be broken, and now the complex doesn't work. And so now, instead of being one genetic disease, it became 6 different ones with 6 different genes and 6 different treatments. So I would say to you, it's going both ways. We're having simplifying where what look like separate syndromes turn out to be the same thing, and other situations where a single clinical phenotype turns into multiple diseases. What I would say to you is this: the clinical definition of a disease is a very crude and, a tool. The closer we get to the genetic cause of diseases, the sooner we start to really understand what's happening. And therefore, whether you think it's more or less, fewer or more, my belief is we're getting much closer to getting truth about what's happening, and that will put us in a better position to do the right thing for those patients.
Hawken, you have one more question to ask.
Yeah, this one has more to do with what you were talking about in terms of the financial incentives versus having a drug get access to patients. So, I mean, how do you balance that, the financial incentives and the need to have revenue for these small, ultra rare biotech companies to getting an orphan drug, having access to patients? And then where can expanded access and compassionate use be improved? Because I know a lot of times through expanded access or compassionate use, the biotech companies don't make any money off of using those drugs. So, and then on top of that, there's right to try now in the US where people have access to that. So I guess how can that that whole process be fixed in a way to give broader access to people?
Well, first off, in order to make this work, there has to be enough incentive to invest the millions of dollars. Now, we've talked about ways to reduce that cost structure, but there has to be enough money in there to make it work. And I was an academic professor. I was working with no money. I had a very altruistic view. But what does altruism get you without resources? It's just failed dreams. The truth is, you need the money. And when I finally started getting industry support, that's when we got things done. That's when it really picked up and we were able to get the treatment developed. The question is whether it should cost us more than $130 million to develop a treatment that affects 200 people. Well, at that kind of cost structure, Hawken, then we're going to have to earn enough revenue. The way the system's working now is that the major developed countries are paying high prices for rare disease drugs because of the cost of getting there. And that is at least floating the operation to make the drug. The question is, what about all the other countries that may not be getting access? And this is where I think companies have to find a way to expand the access. I think, for example, it's come up a lot with companies like the CF drugs with Vertex. That case is a really interesting one because of that very problem. These are small molecule drugs. They spent a lot to develop them. They're good drugs for cystic fibrosis. In some parts of the world, they've held to their high price point, and these are developed world that can't afford it because there's so many CF patients, and they've been not getting access. In other parts of the world, they did a deal which provide the country would pay one number, and then the company is required to treat anyone with CF in the country that's found and diagnosed. What people are calling the Netflix model. In other words, like a fee for treating my country is X, and you're going to pay that. Now, I really like that second model because it's kind of saying to the company, we're not going to run you through the ringer and every single patient, are they going to get treated or reimbursed or not? What we're saying to you is, look, here are this disease. We want the treatment. We need you to price it as if everyone is getting treated and give us that break. And then we won't create barriers. And the net of that is the company gets revenue that they can get and all the patients get treated, right? That to me is a direction that would change the equation from who's getting access and who's not. And I think that we should look toward that, because that the current model where companies price really high and then negotiate for a discount in order to get access, that game has both parties playing a game. The patients are the losers of that game because it takes time, and then the restrictions. And in the end, the company still doesn't get more revenue and the country doesn't get enough patients treated. And the net of it is we're not doing the right thing. It'd be much better to negotiate price and access together, saying, let's say, we'll give you access to all patients, and now think about a price structure that would make sense. I do think it would work better. And companies then could look at that price structure as maybe building steadily over time rather than precipitously for a country's healthcare systems, because as biotech companies, we are in a symbiosis with the healthcare system. We have to provide drugs, they're providing funding, but we can't break the system, nor can they get things treated without us. We both have to help each other get to the end, which means everyone getting access to treatments that have been created.
And we have another question from our fellow from Ghana, Portia. Portia?
Yes, I'm interested in finding out what is accounting for people of color with rare diseases facing disparities in access to care, as well as being underrepresented in research and clinical trials.
Well, I think let's talk about the last one. Research and clinical trials, there's two elements of that in terms of person of color. When we conduct trials, we're in the US, let's say, for example, we're only allowed to provide a certain amount of support. And in a lot of communities, that support may not be adequate because people are getting off their jobs and otherwise. And therefore, there's a tendency for people to be in trials who are well off because they can afford to be in a trial because their mom could not go to, doesn't go to work. It doesn't have to work that day. It doesn't worry about her job or economy. I felt like that access, diversity and access in the US specifically, not Africa at this moment, but in the US specifically, would be greatly improved if the rules around patient support were changed so that if someone's coming to a trial and they have to take off work for it, that the person coming off work to bring their kid to your trial, that they're able to get some compensation for lost work hours, which doesn't exist today, not just expense reimbursement, because the truth is the way the expense reimbursement thing is done right now, it means only people that are relatively wealthy can be in trials. And I think that's one barrier, not the only barrier, but one barrier. The other barrier that probably relates more to Ghana is our ability to conduct trials in diverse countries, right? And the truth is, for most of us, most companies, is we tend to stick to certain regions where we're expecting the approvals. So US, Europe, Japan, some Latin America, maybe. But so because of that, that ends up limiting countries and participating countries in other parts of the world that may have patients. And I think that's unfortunate, but it relates to the regulated concerns of conducting GCP studies. Now, there are a lot of good studies going on in Africa, and there's a lot of drugs that have been studied there, but I would say to you, in the rare space, it's less common. It's less common unless it's highly enriched in Africa. And us as a company, Ultragenyx, we are working on studies now involving the Middle East, Turkey, but not the African continent, not in South Asia, but it's probably one thing that I think more companies need to think about is building into their development programs trial sites in countries that are more diverse and less routinely included.
I hope all of you fellows and those in attendance can understand when I say that my early conversations with Emil truly helped to shape this program and the direction and the focus and what it is that I hope that each of you could take into your reporting. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for taking time with us. And I'd like to ask you one more quick question then. What story would you like to see journalists produce? If you could think of something that could help move the needle or extend the conversation or help with general understanding, can you recommend an idea?
Wow, there's a lot of little ones, but I have to think of an important one. I think the one idea that is important to me that's a global one is creating a system for pricing reimbursement that results in moderating the pricing, but getting everyone treated. That the end game for all of this should be a lower price, but everyone actually treated in our countries. I think that is a fundamental policy goal I wish would happen, that the whole system of pricing reimbursement, this negotiated game that goes on, and the role of HTAs in trying to disparage the science in order to try to make it less valuable. And it's a type of kabuki theater game that's going on that in the end is just price. It's nothing to do with science. And the meantime, patients are getting cut out of the process. And if we could change pricing reimbursement so that we all agree that, hey, this is an approved drug that everyone with this disease should get treated, let's create a plan that gets a moderated price point that will get everyone treated, and that we see a situation where we don't have a whole bunch of countries with very low utilization of really important drugs, then that would be a big improvement in what we're doing these days.
Emil Kakkis, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us. And I hope you will remain open to us reaching out to you if we have more questions or need more guidance in this journey of doing better reporting on rare diseases.
Thank you for having me today, Rachel, and thank you all for your work you're doing.